Today I'm going to take some of the concepts from this week's reading and apply them to my example web project, which is celiactive.com, a site for gluten-free people who are fairly active. So when last we took a look at this site, I had it set up in a very dull format, kind of like this, with just boxes and colors, basically. Nothing too fancy. So this week we're going to take it and try to spruce it up a little bit with some images and using some of the CSS techniques talked about in this week's readings. Okay, so here is my page now, and it's nothing real fancy. In fact, I still don't have enough content on here. I've got this big blank space down here at the bottom, which, I would eventually fill in, but I just wanted to demonstrate some of these CSS concepts here at this site. So let's take a look at the HTML. Here it is. Up at the top, you see we're linking to our style sheet, main.css, in our styles folder. Down here, we've got our body tag kicking off the page, and then following that up immediately is a div called content main, with the ID of content main, that is. And this encompasses pretty much everything on the page all the way down to where we close it off just before we close off the body. So that gives us the ability, if you look at our site, to have this box here floating in the middle and then a background, a gray background, which is our body. Okay, so let's go over and take a look at what comes next. So next we have our header, and this contains our banner. We've also got, if we switch over, some navigation elements that are just sitting here kind of along the bottom edge of our header. This was actually a bit easier to do by just putting our navigation elements within the header. So that's what I did. I originally had them in a separate nav element, but I decided just to move them into the header. So all we have here is an unordered list with some anchor tags. After that, we have a div with an ID of featured articles. Then we have another div with an ID of featured products. These are basically stacked on top of each other. And then down here at the bottom, we've got a style, or sorry, a paragraph with the style, an inline style of clear both. Now this will make a little more sense in another week. But what we're doing with these two divs, our featured article and featured products divs, are we're lining them up next to each other, which requires us to clear that later on. And so that's what we do down here at the bottom with that paragraph. That'll make a little more sense later. Okay, and then we've got our footer, and that's our HTML. After that, we close up our main content div and our body and our HTML page. Okay, so moving on, let's switch over and take a look at our CSS. Some of this stuff we'll pay more attention to later, like pulling in our fancy custom font and working on our gradients and things. So let's just take a look first of all at how we've set up our main content, our content main div. So you'll notice that we've set it up at 90% with a minimum width of 730 pixels and a maximum width of 1320. And then we've got a margin of 0 and auto. So let's show you a little bit about the reasoning behind these styles. Switch back over and take a look at our page. 90% on the width means that I want this div to take up 90% of the page width-wise. So 100%, of course, starts you from left, far left, takes you all the way over to far right. And what I'm telling this page is I always want this middle, what I'm telling the browser is that I always want this middle div to take up 90% of that space, however big or large our browser window gets. So as I size down our browser window, you see it just pushes that inner div in, and as I pull it out, it comes out with it. So this is a very flexible layout. It just resizes with us. Now, there hit a point setting up our page this way as I was looking at it where things got so squishy that this little featured products column eventually started popping down and things started to look ugly. And so to keep that from happening, I picked kind of a point, a minimum point just before things started to break, and made that our minimum width. So if we look at our CSS here, we've got a minimum width of 730 pixels. I've played around with things a little bit since. Maybe I could make that 720 since that's a bit more of a standard breakpoint. But let's pull that in. Okay, 720, I like that better. That's good. So we can stop right there. That's just about the point where somebody's on an iPad tablet. Okay, so let's pull it out. And at some point I thought that this was getting a little bit too long to read this way. So at some point I actually also set a maximum width on this. And you'll see I set a max width of 1320 pixels, which, you know, looks okay on a widescreen laptop like mine. And so that's what we're going to go with for now. In future chapters, you know, we'll look at how we can use some things like media queries and whatnot to, you know, do some more interesting things the smaller we get, so we can go past 720 pixels and actually rearrange the look of our page to be a little bit more linear as we go smaller. And that'll be kind of fun when we get there. But for now, I just went ahead and constrained it so that we don't go smaller than 720 pixels wide on our main content main div, and we don't go any wider than 1320. Okay, now let's just take a look at the difference between using percentages versus using pixels. I could have done straight pixels. I could have said 960 pixels, which is a pretty standard width for sites these days. So I'll save that, come over to our site and refresh. And now we've got a fixed width, 960. There we go. Nothing particularly wrong with this, to be honest. It's just, you know, displays very nicely on most desktop browsers. It's not too terribly thin, not too terribly wide. It really kind of looks nice to the eyes. The text doesn't read too far over this way. It's just not terribly flexible, so in this case I decided we wanted something that would be flexible, and then eventually maybe we could transition into looking good on mobile or on wider screens or whatever. So that's why we went ahead with percentages instead of pixels. So let's just go ahead and change that back. 90%, hit save, and we're back to our more flexible layout. Now we had to make a couple of other decisions. Once we decided that we were going to be based on percentages this way and be resizing, we had to make some additional choices in terms of our padding and our margin so that we would continue to be flexible. Because if I had just said, you know, 90%, but then I'd done pixels for things like my padding on my text here and on my margins, then things would start to look funny a lot earlier as we got smaller because things wouldn't resize within our 90% div, and so things would start to smash up against each other, or actually more likely as we went smaller, things would start to look like they were actually pushing out too far, like our text here wouldn't squish in nicely to leave space over here. Our you know, our navigation and padding here wouldn't adjust with our browser, so things would start to actually look a little bit too spread out for the size. So let's look at some of those other decisions that we had to make. So we had to make a decision on the padding for our main content div. This is this space here, but this was important. We had to set up some padding. If we hadn't set that up, I'll show you what would have happened. I'll pull that out, save, refresh, and all of a sudden, look, there's nothing, no room to breathe here around my text. Now that actually looks kind of nice if you ask me, up here on our header, so maybe we'll have to play with that, and maybe we could actually take out some of the white space in here and play around with that a bit more. But for now, I want to have my white backdrop, and I want to have just some padding around there, so I'll just restore that. I'll think about going back to something else a little bit later. Like, for example, if I were to remove our background color on our main content div, that looks actually okay. But I'm going to be demonstrating this drop shadow later, so we'll bring our white back. I'm just playing around here. Okay, save. Let's refresh again. There we go. There's our white. Okay, so and then let's see. So there's my padding. I've got my text aligning to the left. The only part here where you will see some pixels is on our box shadow. So I put a box shadow around our main content div, and that's just because that's just how that works. That just takes pixels. That is our little drop shadow here on the right. If I were to pull that off, ta-da, our drop shadow is gone. Okay, so the other thing we have going on here, we have a border radius, and I went with pixels on this too because percentages just behaved a little bit funny. It wasn't so rounded, it was more just kind of peaked. But I have a border radius on about everything here of 10 pixels. We're using ems, and we're doing that instead of pixels. It's a little bit more flexible, and it's what the W3C recommends. And so that's what we're going with. You can use pixels for your text if you want. Most browsers seem to handle it okay. I'm just trying to show, I guess, the most accepted practices here with ems. And yeah, we'll just cruise down here and look for any more percentages. So here you'll notice is our header. We've got our background image, which is loading from our site. It's not repeating. I'll show you here we've got our background size of cover. And what would happen if we pulled that off? Here, save, come up here to the top, refresh. Look what happens. I have a rather large background image, and I did that on purpose because I want it to resize with our page. You can't really see it here, but as I start to get bigger, I start to actually see my background image a little bit better. But I wanted to be able to have a fairly large background image that would scale with us. But then I wanted to be able to have that background image fit within my box. So that's where that background size cover works well. Now I could have also done background size contain. Let's see what happens when we do that. When I go background size contain, then it just squishes that whole image into the header space here so that the header contains the whole image. But the problem is then our aspect ratio, our height versus width, isn't appropriate to cover this whole distance, and so we get cut off, and it looks like we lose our rounded corner and our header all the way up until we get down to kind of smaller size, and then we start to have trouble with the image not pushing all the way down into our border radius setting here on the bottom. So we have a number of problems with background contain, background size contain. So let's just switch that back to cover. And what that says is fit the image basically 100% across the header this way and allow it to push down below the div this way, and then as we resize you notice that the background image resizes with us. That's actually pretty similar to if we were to do a background size of 100%. Basically, we'd get the same thing. No change, it just refreshed, and the same thing's happening. So I'll just switch it back. Let's just make sure that's right. Okay, yep. Okay, and then I've set up a margin, a bottom margin of 1.8%. Again, I went with percentages rather than pixels just so it would resize well, minutely, albeit, as we move our browser window, but it'll still resize with it. And here's our header where I've set up our font. Again, on our margins, I'm setting up percentages here on the left, and padding, I'm setting percentages. Now I could have on this as well, I could have done something like pushed it in by 100 or by 80 pixels. I could have used pixels instead for my margin. Ooh, maybe I did want 100. Or let's do 130. And go even bigger, 180. Pixels are a little bit easier to work with because you aren't kind of guessing at your percentages, but notice there as we resize, our text really just kind of stays put, and when we get bigger it starts to look kind of squishy. When we get smaller it starts to look kind of wide. Actually it doesn't look too bad, but if we were to allow it to go bigger or smaller, we'd gradually have more and more problems there. So let's just go ahead and change that back to 20%. Save, refresh. And there, we're a little bit more consistent the further out and the smaller we go. It just kind of resizes with us. Okay, moving on down, any other percentages we need to be aware of? There's one, but I don't want to get into that one yet. We'll worry about that another time. We've set up percentages on our padding around our navigation, around our lead article. You'll notice here I've got a width of 76% on our lead article div, and I've got a width of 15% around our featured products div. Now you might be wondering, why am I, if you add these up, you get actually around, well, you get a little bit more than 90%, 91%. And you might be wondering, how is that I have this main content div at 90%, and then I've got these two divs here at 76% and at 15%, and then we've even got room to spare in the middle. You might be wondering how that is. How can we be doing that? Well, the percentage for these elements that are within the main content div is relative to what's containing it. So when we set up our 76%, we're telling the browser to display this div at 76% of whatever its parent container is. So in this case, the main content div. So 76% of the main content div is what this is taking up, rather than, it's not 76% of the whole browser window. So you got to think of what's containing what it is you're setting the size for. Okay, so hopefully that's all made sense. I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording here, and we'll come back and take a look at some of these a little bit later.